And I wanted to go to Egypt so that I could see the pyramids for myself and assess the idea that these structures were used to produce electricity, which is the most popular theory about the function of the Great Pyramid. However, as I began to explore the sites, specifically a location known as Abu Sir and the Pyramid of Neferkare, we were exploring the site and I found this red quartzite collection bowl and conduit system that runs from the pyramid itself underneath this huge floor of black basalt into this collection bowl. And that's when I began to develop the idea that they were producing and collecting aqueous solutions of chemicals. So generally speaking, my theory is that the Egyptian pyramids are a series of chemical reactors that were designed to produce at least a half dozen different chemicals in series. But they were powered by electric fields coming from lightning, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a little bit. So overall, that's my theory, is that the Egyptian pyramids were designed for chemical engineering and chemical manufacturing.
So what made you come to this conclusion about them being chemical processors and the bowls being collectors of chemicals? Do you have a background in chemistry?
No, so I have a degree in psychology and a minor in Spanish and just sort of a lifelong passion for chemistry and physics. And I was really inspired by first the collection bowl in Abu Sir. And then our next expedition was to go inside of the Red Pyramid of Dashur. And as soon as I went down into these reaction chambers, I noticed that there was chemical staining all over the walls inside of the Red Pyramid, which was very, very unusual. And typically the explanation for the staining is that it's somehow caused by bats. And I knew immediately when I heard that explanation that there's no way that was the actual explanation for what's causing this staining. And fast forward now 5 years later, we have a chemical analysis from samples of that staining that were taken from the walls of the chambers that conclusively prove it has absolutely nothing to do with bats. It is extrusions of metal compounds that are coming out of the stone itself due to high temperature reactions occurring inside of these chambers and fluctuations in temperature and pressure. So you got to imagine like a sponge, right? Squeezing out liquid material. So the stone itself has to be heated to a high enough temperature to be able to liquefy these compounds, and there has to be fluctuations of pressure inside of the structure that cause these extrusions to come out of the stone. So that was the first thing I noticed inside of the Red Pyramid that began to inspire the idea that these were designed for chemical reactions. The next thing inside the Red Pyramid is as you go through the sequence of chambers. So you get down the entry shaft, you're in the first chamber, and you'll immediately notice the smell of ammonia. Now, this smell of ammonia is typically explained as also being from bats. But my wife and I, we've been in plenty of other structures in Egypt that have tons of bats inside them. And the smell inside of these chambers, for example, Mastaba 17 in the Fayum Oasis, is filled with bats. And it smells like what you would imagine a cage full of rodents would smell like, right? Just imagine what that would smell. That's what a bat cave smells like. We've also been inside the Tomb of the Birds, which is this underground tunnel network that runs below the Giza Plateau, a very rarely discussed feature of the Giza Plateau that is critical to how this system operated. And it's basically a leach mining tunnel that was used to use acidic solutions that flowed through this tunnel to extract the metallic ore deposits that are inside of the Tomb of the Birds. But it's a bat cave now, and there's tons of bats that live in there. And again, it smells like a rodent cage. But inside of the Red Pyramid of Dashur...
And you've been down there?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's technically what you would say an off-limits or forbidden area of the Giza Plateau, but I have videos on my channel, The Land of Chem, CHEM, of us going down inside the Tomb of the Birds. And
these are channels that run underground through the Giza Plateau?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So
how big are we talking?
So it's a pretty large, again, you know, the diameter of the opening of the tunnel is probably 15 feet by 15 feet.
Oh, wow.
So it's a huge tunnel system that runs from one side of the Giza Plateau directly toward and underneath the central pyramid of Giza. And these tunnels have been known about since antiquity. And the Roman explorers that were investigating the Giza Plateau called these things syringes. And the original name for the Giza Plateau is Rostau, which means mouth of the passages. So there's all of this nomenclature in regard to the Giza Plateau that is indicative of the knowledge of these underground metallic ore mining tunnels. And we did have an opportunity to go inside of this thing, and it was pretty wild because this whole tunnel is filled with iron ore deposits. And we also have chemical analysis that's been taken from a variety of sample locations across the Giza Plateau of these iron ore deposits, which nobody ever talks about these things, but they're a critical part of the operation of the Giza Plateau.
Is this a photo of them?
So this is actually the Osiris shaft, which we've also been down inside the Osiris shaft, which is another underground chamber system running below the Giza Plateau. This one is below the causeway of the Central Pyramid. But I do have some videos on my channel showing the inside of the Tomb of the Birds. So, but after this experience inside the Red Pyramid of Dashur, seeing the chemical staining and smelling this, it is pure ammonia. Again, we have those smelling salts over there, and it's the exact same experience. Mm-hmm. So you start in the.
You sure it's the same?
Let's take a whiff here, and we can see.
There you go, brother.
It's very similar, and it's definitely not from bats. It is a completely different smell. It is pure chemical ammonia, as if you were to take a jug of ammonia of cleaning solution from underneath your kitchen counter, put your nose in it, and smell it. Mm-hmm. And it gets progressively stronger as you pass through the 3 chambers. So you get into the first one, the smell of ammonia is a little weak. You get into the secondary reaction chamber and it gets stronger. Mm-hmm. And then as you climb the stairs to ascend into the final synthesis chamber, the smell of ammonia is staggering. It's like putting your nose inside of that, inside of this final synthesis chamber. And in my opinion, bats don't have a coordinated strategy for their urination plan, and they're all going to decide just to go into this one chamber and pee inside of this one chamber.
Right.
And people also say that it's because of the guards going down there and urinating. And I can assure you, it takes a good 10 minutes to get down the shaft into the Red Pyramid. It's a very laborious process to get down inside of these pyramid structures. And if you have to take a leak, you're just going to do it on the outside of the pyramid because it's a heck of a lot easier just to pee off the side of this thing or go into the desert as opposed to crawling down inside of the chambers. So that is a fallacious explanation of the cause of the staining and the smell of ammonia. And again, now we have chemical analysis thanks to my colleagues at the Acida Project, where they took probably hundreds of samples back in 2010 of a variety of different things throughout Egypt and all of the ancient structures around there. And they did chemical analysis of all this stuff. So we actually have some detailed information about exactly what these compounds are that are on the walls of the Red Pyramid. So it's definitely not from bats.
So
yes.
Can you explain your hypothesis in a nutshell? Basically, you think that the Red Pyramid was manufacturing chemicals for what purpose? And what was the function of the other 2 pyramids?
Yes.
How did the whole thing work?
Okay, so there are 2 major pyramids in Dashur, the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid.
Okay.
We also have the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, and then there are 3 different major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. There's actually 12 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. So there's a lot more than just the Great Pyramid up there.
Okay.
So let's start with the Red Pyramid.
Okay.
Ammonia is by far the most important chemical that we have synthesized in the modern day. So during the Industrial Revolution, chemical manufacturing on an industrial scale was being developed as a legitimate science. And one of the first chemicals that we synthesized on an industrial scale was ammonia. And ammonia is one of the most important chemicals that we use today for fertilizers. It completely transformed the modern world, being able to manufacture massive scale of fertilizer in terms of population expansion, and everything that we've seen in the development of the modern day is literally dedicated and dependent on our production of ammonia. Still to this day, we use ammonia-based fertilizers because it has a very high content of nitrogen. So the 2 pyramids in Dashur, the primary function for these 2 chemicals, which is ammonia and ammonium bicarbonate, is for fertilizer production. You got to feed the people. So I do believe that there was a massive civilization that lived in the upper eastern corner of Africa, basically what we know today as Egypt, and fertilizers would have been a huge part of what they were producing in terms of the chemical supply that they had. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is to establish the function of the geology of the Egyptian pyramids. So predominantly inside of these structures, there's 3 types of materials, and all 3 of these types of stones have very specific functions. So when you're looking at limestone, which is the majority of the body of the pyramids are made from limestone. Limestone is a dielectric material that has the capacity for storing electric fields. Then you have red granite. Red granite is also a dielectric material, but there's a very special property about red granite is that it has high content of crystalline quartz. And a lot of people talk about the piezoelectric property of quartz in regard to the function of the Great Pyramid. But in my research, I've determined that it's actually something called the inverse piezoelectric property, where the stone and the quartz is introduced to an electric field, which leads to the production of ultrasound. So a lot of people talk about the sound properties of the Egyptian pyramids, and the big question is, how are these sound properties activated? Well, it's activated by the interface of these electric fields coursing through the red granite, causing vibrations within the quartz that produce ultrasound. And we'll get to that when we talk about the function of the Great Pyramid, which utilizes ultrasound as a sonochemical acoustic catalyst. So this is a sort of a breaking field in modern day chemistry where they're using sound waves to catalyze chemical reactions. And that'll be directly applicable to the conversion of sulfur dioxide into sulfur trioxide inside what I call the contact process chamber or the grand gallery of the Great Pyramid.
Okay.
So let me skip through. So this is black basalt, and this is going to be particularly relevant when we get back to the function of the Great Pyramid, because the Great Pyramid also has a black basalt temple floor on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid. And one of my most interesting discoveries was that black basalt.
When you say temple floor,
Yes.
where's there a floor?
Yep. So it basically looks like this. So this black basalt flooring.
You're saying like the base, the foundation of the whole pyramid is on this?
So it's just on the eastern side, very similar configuration to what you see here. And this is adjacent to the pyramid of Userkaf in Saqqara. And I also have had special permission access into the pyramid of Userkaf, which is also on my YouTube channel.
Okay.
And this is one of the locations where we discovered the mysterious blue stone of Egypt. There's a completely destroyed container that's made of this blue sandstone, which is a very unusual material. So black basalt, even in the modern day applications, is used as a material for heat storage. And there's tons of research that specifically references black basalt from Egypt being tested and analyzed for a material for heat storage.
Okay.
So here at the pyramid of Nayusare in Abu Sir, there's this red granite or this red quartzite actually, red quartzite conduit system. So you're looking now at the inlet of this conduit system, and this red granite conduit runs underneath this black basalt temple floor in this direction, and it leads into a red quartzite collection bowl at the end of the conduit system. And the conventional explanation for this component is that it's for drainage of rainwater.
Okay.
Which to me doesn't really make a lot of sense, because red quartzite, it's not an exotic type of geology, but if you were just making a drainage channel, you would just carve it out of bedrock or limestone, and you wouldn't need to go through all of the extra effort of transporting this red quartzite to the site, carving it out of a much more difficult material to work with than limestone. And in my opinion, you don't collect rainwater. Right. So why would you be collecting rainwater drainage running off the side of your pharaonic burial? Again, the conventional story is that these things are pharaonic burials. So that explanation,
Pharaoh tombs.
Correct, right. So why would you want to collect the drainage water running off the side of your tomb?
So this little channel that's dug into this piece of rock here.
Correct.
Water or liquid could drain through it, and what came off? What happens at the end right there?
Right. So this is the collection bowl.
Okay.
The conduit goes underneath this black basalt floor, and it deposits whatever they were collecting into this red quartzite collection bowl, which is exquisitely crafted.
Wow.
So they went through a lot of effort to make this component. And to me, this is not indicative of rainwater drainage. This is indicative of collecting something that had very particular importance to the civilization that built these things. And the first time I saw this, the immediate thought that popped into my head was aqueous chemicals, liquid chemicals, because it had to be something that was very, very important for them to collect it, and then they would do something with that chemical. So the reason that they've utilized...
Yeah, rain, if it rained, that thing would be overflowing in like an hour.
Right. And if you were, draining rainwater, you would just drain it back into the bedrock or back into the Nile River.
Right, exactly.
And you have a huge source of water, and they could definitely purify water. So you don't need to collect rainwater drainage when you're right next to the Nile River, which is a abundant source of water. So that never really made sense. So this is the first artifact that completely changed my perception about the function of the Egyptian pyramids and pointed me toward the production of chemicals.
That's so interesting. I've never seen this before.
And this is... there's so many things to unpack about this particular site, but I'll mention two things. So the black basalt paving stones. So anytime you see black basalt, just remember heat storage.
Okay.
So once this material gets hot, it's interfacing with these electric fields that come from lightning strikes. And we'll get to how this occurs, how it's attracted, harnessed, and distributed through the pyramid systems here in just a little bit. But electric fields are going into this dielectric material.
Okay.
Dielectric materials are the most important thing about the ancient science, is understanding the properties of these stones as being functional components of the Egyptian pyramids. So the electric fields would course into this black basalt, heating up the material, and it would stay hot. The reason they implemented this black basalt was to prevent coagulation of the liquid solution that was flowing through this thing, and to maintain any suspended particles within the solution. So let's say you have a viscous chemical flowing through this conduit. If it gets cold, it could clog up the pipe.
Right.
So they implemented a material that could be utilized for heat storage applications, because once it got hot, it stayed hot, and it maintained the fluid flow through that channel into the collection bowl.
Got it.
And let's say you have valuable suspended particles in this solution.
And where's the solution coming from?
Right, so directly from the reaction chambers.
And where is the reaction chamber? This is inside of the pyramid?
Inside of the pyramid, yep.
Okay. How far away, roughly? So
the base and the inlet of this conduit is right up adjacent to the eastern side of the pyramid.
What's the distance, would you say?
I mean, 5 feet.
Oh, that close.
Yeah, so literally, so with this particular pyramid, the casing stones have all been removed off of the exterior. So the edge where the original casing stones would have been, it's several feet back because you have the body of the core still intact, but the casing stones have been completely removed. So the distance between the core and the inlet of this conduit system is, 5 or 6 feet. But if the original casing stones were still in place, it would literally be adjacent to the side of the pyramid.
Okay. Wow.
So essentially, the conduit is running underneath this whole black basalt paving stone. Again, that black basalt, this is just showing dielectric constants, which is a way to gauge the capacity of a material to store these electric fields. And all of these materials are dielectric materials with the capacity for storing electric fields. So I just wanted to show you that artifact, and this is basically the configuration of...
And this is Abu Sir we're talking about still?
Abu Sir, correct.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
the configuration of the Pyramid of Niuserre.
Okay.
And you can see in red that is the path of this conduit system, and there's another one adjacent to it as well that also has a collection bowl, which I've never found that in person. This is from the 1900s from an archaeologist called Borchardt that did the original excavations of the pyramids of Abu Sir.
Okay.
I haven't ever found the second one, but it's on my list. Abu Sir is one of these sites that you need special permission access from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities to go out and investigate the site, and we've been very fortunate. I always go to the sites on my tours, and I have a tour coming up in November where we also have special permission access to Abu Sir.
Remind me one more time the name of the pyramid at Abu Sir.
Yep. So there's the Pyramid of Neferkare, the Pyramid of Niuserre, and the Pyramid of Sahure. So there's 3 major pyramids out there. But Abu Sir is also adjacent to a site called Abu Ghurab. that has those white calcite crystal bowls that have almost the gear-like configuration around the outside. And they also have some very interesting, and this is just an image of, the electric fields from lightning strikes permeating this dielectric material that cause it to get hot, maintaining the fluidity of the solution running through the conduit.
Are you aware of any sort of evidence of any sort of saw blades that can explain those cuts on those massive stones that Ben Van Kerkwijk talks about? Like those massive circular saw cuts that are in those stones where it looks like they're using a fucking circular saw.
Yeah, tube drill. Yeah, tube drills. Yeah, so they've also taken chemical analysis from inside of these tube drills.
Like these?
Yeah, so you find these all over the Giza Plateau.
The bottom left one, Steve, that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, so that's on the Giza Plateau. Those are saw blade cuts that are in the Black Basalt Temple on the eastern floor of the Great Pyramid. And they found this great, I've seen it in person up close where you can see the remnants of this bluish green material down inside of these saw cuts. Yeah, so it's this arsenical copper or arsenical bronze with a mixture of the slurries. Now,
so this slurry you're talking about is something that was used to make it more abrasive so those whatever saws they had could penetrate the stone far more easy.
Correct. And we still use this in modern stone cutting applications where you have the blade, but you're also pouring an abrasive slurry during the cutting process, which facilitates the removal of the material. And this is what we were talking about, how it's not necessarily the speed of the tool, but it's the feed rate. That it was possibly a very slow-moving saw, but they were removing a lot of material with each cut of the blade, which is indicative that they were using a slurry compound to facilitate the cutting process.
But what about the overcuts?
Yes.
Because it looks like, when you're using a saw and you're cutting something and you move too fast, you pull the saw up and then you correct yourself and then you go straight again. So if they were going slow, how would you explain the overcuts?
So I believe, again, I do agree with the idea that there were machines. It's not, two guys with a saw that are moving this thing back and forth, because if you had an error in the cutting process and it was just a hand operated two guys and a saw blade, if they messed up, you could stop very quickly the cutting process. But if you're using a machine apparatus, I could pull it up in the slides, but if you Google the Hierapolis saw, it's a perfect example of a saw cutting machine that was being utilized by the ancient Romans, and the Romans got everything they knew about cutting and moving stone from the dynastic Egyptians. Now, I don't think that the Egyptian pyramids are part of the dynastic civilization. I believe that they came around before that in a period known as the Saharan wet period, which is about 8500 BC to around 3500 BC, just before the beginning of the dynastic civilization.
So after the Younger Dryas.
Correct. Now, this is also a time period where the Sahara...
This is the saw you were talking about?
Correct, yeah. So basically, you have a water wheel powered saw that's connected to a series of gears. We were talking about gear ratios. So if you have a big gear and a small gear, the knowledge of gear ratio physics could very easily give you a very fast moving saw blade. And this was what was implemented by the Romans, where they have this wooden configuration, these huge saw blade systems. Now imagine this being set up at your quarry site, where you have a huge water wheel powered saw blade cutting system. And this is like, there's hundreds of these set up all over the quarry sites that are constantly just cutting stone. And
they're made of wood. And what do you think the saw is made out of?
Metal saw blades. So by the time, they were probably still using arsenical copper during the time, but then this also sort of moves into the Iron Age a bit later on.
Okay, so they use these giant saws with some sort of slurry chemical compound that would help those things cut the stone, and they moved slow. But then how the hell do they get those fucking blocks up on top of that pyramid? How big are the blocks in the King's Chamber? Those pieces of granite?
So the blocks of the upper portions, they call them the relieving chambers inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. Those are very, very large. But one thing about the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, so for example, at the top of the pyramid, those are the smallest stones used in the construction. They put the biggest stones down at the bottom, and every successive layer of the Egyptian pyramids, the stones get smaller and smaller the higher you go up.
Right. But how big? So, Stephen, type in like the granite blocks inside the King's Chamber, and because there's like
they're huge.
There's levels of them, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So I don't know the specific weight. I was going to say 65 tons. This thing here says 70 tons. But
So
yeah,
there's
those
70-ton granite blocks.
Those are incredibly large.
There you go. Yeah, click on that.
Yep.
Well, that's shitty. Maybe the next one? Maybe you can blow it up. So I want people to be able to see the, zoom in on that thing. So there's like, why the hell would they do that? Those massive 70-ton granite blocks with gaps in between them.
Yep.
With like a little TP roof on top. And that's pretty high up in the pyramid, right? The King's Chamber?
Correct. Yeah, it's about in the center of the structure. So it's
Okay.
not all the way at the top, but
Right.
it is fairly high within the construction itself.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no good explanation. I don't really focus too much on the construction aspect because it's one of those mysteries where, I mean, you could really
Right.
speculate all day about how they did it. There's a great researcher named Stephen Meyer
Mm-hmm.
that proposes that the pyramids were built using water apparatuses and that they were
Mm-hmm.
floated to the construction site using like wooden barges. And they recently published an article that corroborates that idea,
Mm-hmm.
where they found a system of channels leading up to the Giza Plateau.
Right.
And you can use water enclosures and a system of water locks
Right.
to move these stones up to the pyramid sites. And then let's say you establish your outer layer of casing stones first.
Yes.
You could then fill that area with water and use that to float the stones up to each other layer. So that's Stephen Meyer's idea.
Huh.
And it's a very interesting idea because
Yeah.
I do believe that this civilization, they were masters of hydraulics, and they would have used water to their advantage in basically every application, whether it be construction of the pyramids or specifically regarding my research, water facilitates these chemical reactions, whether it's the mechanism of operation to push the chemicals through the system, also used as chemical reactants. Water is used inside the red pyramid. It's also used inside the Great Pyramid. Well, it's used inside all the pyramids, actually, in terms of the mechanism of operation that drives these things is water.
What do you think the reason that those granite blocks inside the King's Chamber, the bottoms of them are like perfectly flat, right? And
Yep.
the tops are kind of like they're not perfect. They're kind of rough.
Yeah, so that's from the construction. So you see where the rough part is in the core and the flat part is laying on the level of stone below it. Mm-hmm. So they use that to make sure that it was level going all the way up with each level. You don't need the center piece because it was exposed to the inside of these relieving chambers. But on the edge of each one, they're flattened out. But in the center, they're completely rough.
Right.
So this was also a civilization that understood the mentality of work smarter and not harder.
So you think that the rough part, it didn't matter.
It didn't matter, right?
Right.
It was never going to be utilized. So I also believe that these structures are geometrically configured to amplify sound.
Oh yeah, I think it's like F sharp that resonates through that whole pyramid, right?
Correct.
The Great Pyramid.
Yeah. So like when you have the inside of a guitar or a violin, for example, it's very important to precisely tune the inside of that device because that's what causes the sound amplification.
Right.
So the geometry of the inside of these chambers was very, very important. And the finishing of the inside, for example, when we talk about the Serapeum in Saqqara, these huge containers inside the Serapeum that mostly are not finished on the outside, but they were very, very intent about finishing the inside of these containers. So there was something about the acoustic properties of the inside of the container for amplification that wasn't necessary to finish the outside. So that's why I do believe that the bottoms are flat, was just to ensure that each level went up correctly, but then the rest of it wasn't necessary to flatten everything out.
Now, Egypt was green when you imagine that these were built, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So that takes us back to the time period of their construction and operation, which is a time period known as the Saharan wet period. And there was prolific rainfall in the upper eastern Sahara during this time period. And we see the agricultural areas that were located along the Nile River moving out into the upper eastern Sahara. And I believe that the terraforming applications, so not only creating thunderstorms, but also use fertilizers to go out and transform the desert into an agriculturally rich farmland. So this is the secondary application for the Egyptian pyramids and the ancient structures in Ireland, these stone circle systems and the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England. So we recently had a research expedition to England and Ireland. and we were exploring these White Horse Hills that all have standing stones at the top of these hills. And there's 2 sloping sides. We'll get to it here in just a minute on these hills. And they're inscribed with a white horse. Now, the white horse is relatively modern, but if you look at the symbolism of the white horse, it is an ancient symbol for thunderstorms and lightning. In all of these ancient religions and mythologies, the white horse symbol has existed to indicate cumulonimbus clouds and lightning gods.
Okay.
So there is a direct secret in plain sight emblazoned on the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England, indicating that these hills were used to generate thunderstorms. And I'll get to exactly how that was happening here in just a minute.
Okay.
But that led me to the final conclusion about the operation of the Egyptian pyramids, which were also to produce thunderstorms, which is a direct connection to what Randall Carlson is working on with the modern thunderstorm generator.
Okay.
And
I can't wait to see how this is
oh,
all
dude,
connected.
yeah. Oh, dude, it's all going to wrap up together. And it's again, I never intended to stumble across all of these discoveries, but it's one of those things that once you start pulling the thread, the whole thing starts to unravel. And when you look at it from the perspective of physics and chemistry, everything really starts to make sense in terms of the configuration of the chambers.
Okay, so you first you came up with this hypothesis about how these pyramids were chemical processing plants and why they produced chemicals. You assume it's for fertilizer.
One application, yes.
One of the applications is for fertilizer. How did you become aware of the hills in England that you claim are built to or are there to generate thunderstorms or cumulonimbus clouds?
Yeah.
How did you discover this?
So the universe works in mysterious ways, and there's been some synchronicities along my journey that I never could have anticipated. So we went to England. I was going to propose to my wife, Alexa, at Stonehenge. So I went there this was the whole impetus of our trip to England and Ireland was A for the proposal. We were going to go to Stonehenge and drive around that area so that we could investigate the ancient structures around Stonehenge. And then we were going to go to Ireland so that I could finally document all of the structures, for example, Newgrange and all of these other passage chamber structures that are directly already included in my first book in terms of the production of a chemical called ferrous sulfate. And we'll get to that here in a minute.
Okay.
But the White Horse Hills were kind of an unexpected discovery where, we're driving around and looking on Google Maps for ancient sites, and we just happened to see this structure called the Cheryl Obelisk.
Okay.
So this guy built an obelisk on top of one of these White Horse Hills in the place where the standing stone once originally was erected. So I had to see this thing in person, an obelisk on top of one of these hills in England, because I knew that there was a connection again to ancient Egypt.
Right.
And
this obelisk was built, like the 1800s or something?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You can Google Cheryl Obelisk. I don't know the specific dates of when it was erected, but it's a relatively modern addition to the site. But they say that it's hollow, and it was built upon the place where the standing stone originally stood on top of this hill. So these things were designed to give lightning the shortest path to ground.
Okay.
It is the highest point of elevation anywhere on the landscape, and you have this huge standing stone which would have acted like a lightning rod. And all of these structures are built on chalk bedrock.
Okay.
It's Cheryl, Cherril.
ERR.
Yep, the Cheryl Obelisk.
First try.
Yeah.
Look at that one next to that on the right. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
No, that's it. That's the same thing. And it's this huge obelisk on this hill. And again, you're standing up there, and it is by far the highest point on the landscape.
So you saw this, and what made you think thunderstorms?
So when I first went to Egypt in 2017, I had this intuition that the Great Pyramid specifically was being struck by lightning. And now we have evidence from these chemical analysis of samples from the Giza Plateau that proves that there were lightning strikes on the plateau. They found these silicate microspherules from fulgurites. So fulgurites are essentially fossilized lightning. So when lightning strikes sand, for example, it'll fuse all of this sand together and it produces silicate microspherules.
Right.
in some of the chemical analysis that was taken by the Acida project, they found these silicate microspherules from fulgurites, which is direct evidence that the area around the Great Pyramid was being struck by lightning. They found these next to a structure called the Trial Passages, which is on the northeastern corner of the Great Pyramid. So I had this intuition back in 2017, and I always knew that lightning was the power source of the Egyptian pyramids, because you have to have a power source to drive all these chemical reactions. And I truly believe that the Egyptian pyramids and all of these ancient structures across the planet were designed to work in conjunction with the forces of nature. They were harnessing these naturally occurring phenomenon, like the telluric currents flowing through the surface of the earth, which is something that was Nikola Tesla was huge into researching telluric currents because they're extremely important in the function of our planet. Storm systems, telluric currents are directly connected to lightning strike locations. And I believe Tesla was on this.
And earthquakes.
Correct. Yeah, they're all connected. So I'm a huge proponent of the electric universe theory, and that our entire solar system is a huge electromagnetic system. So everything that's happening on the sun, the moon, the planets, and the earth are all this interconnected electrical system. And I believe this is knowledge that was possessed by this ancient civilization that we still fully don't understand, the mechanisms of operation that go into how our planet work. And I believe this ancient civilization knew this, which is why when you see the medieval alchemists, they always did all of their chemical reactions and sacred rituals in conjunction with the movement of the planet and the stars, because they understood that there were specific events and electromagnetic phenomenon that occurred during these conjunctions and solar alignments and lunar alignments and planetary conjunctions and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Same reason why the Egyptian pyramids are also aligned to these same phenomenon.
So, okay. You had an intuition where you saw the pyramids and you just thought lightning. You just thought this has to have something to do with lightning.
Yeah, I remember I was sitting at the Mina house and I was smoking a cigar and sitting there eating dinner, and I was looking up at these things and I was like, man, if there was any sort of electrical storm, this is by far the tallest structure on the landscape. And lightning is always going to seek the shortest path to ground in an area where there's a differential in the charges, right? So lightning occurs because there's negative charges in the atmosphere, positive charges on the ground. That causes the electrostatic discharge of lightning.
Does lightning still strike the Great Pyramid a lot today?
I've heard anecdotally that people have said that they have seen it, but there's also not a lot of thunderstorms anymore. This goes back to the time period of operation during the Saharan wet period, where the pyramids were actually operational. And the operation of the Egyptian pyramids was directly related to the terraforming of the Eastern Sahara. I believe that the Saharan wet period is a direct result of the terraforming applications of the Egyptian pyramids, and that these things were built to create this transformation of the landscape, to bring the rainstorms to the area. They were producing chemicals to fertilize all of this sand and turn it into rich agricultural farmland. So they are infrastructure constructions, right? So one of the things is, what is the reason for building these huge monuments?
And why do they have to be so perfect too? Because they're chemical plants. How do you explain the precision? Do they need that precision? Those like perfectly square structure, like the circumference of the pyramid, or when you measure like the angles, all the angles are perfect, and the slopes are exactly the same.
Yeah. So we go into precision tolerance machining these days, right? And the more precise your machine is, the better it operates.
Yes.
And these things were designed to harness these electric fields, the telluric currents flowing through the earth, also these specific alignments of the planets, the sun and the moon. So the more specific the alignments, the more precise the device, the more effective the production of the machine. So the Great Pyramid had a very sophisticated mechanism of operation where it created a self-protective coating compound that protected the inside of the chamber.
Okay.
So I propose that the King's Chamber is actually a sulfur furnace reaction chamber, where sulfur dioxide was introduced into the chamber and it was reacted with air. So you do have these air shafts leading into the King's Chamber. And my hypothesis is that they were literally just air intakes. You don't have Like, he said that, the maser and the hydron emission and all this stuff, it's literally just an air intake to bring air into your furnace chamber. Because you need air to facilitate the reaction of sulfur dioxide and oxygen into sulfur trioxide.
Okay, but if it was one of those air intakes in the King's chamber has like a crazy bends to it, where it goes around that new void they found that's like the size of a jumbo jet or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was the scan pyramids or something. The scan pyramid project, they scanned it and they figured out there's this big undiscovered void.
Correct.
That's next to the Grand Gallery, and one of those shafts that goes out of the King chamber does all these crazy like right turn and angles to avoid that thing.
Correct.
To wrap around it.
Yes.
So like that's another crazy question to this thing. If they built this like amazing machine out of these massive blocks, and they had a plan to do this, why wouldn't they build it in a better way where it could just be like a straight shaft out and then be like, instead of trying to like avoid some other part of it that they built? It seems like they just like, if like either they just figured it out as they went and they were like, oh shit, we gotta work our way around this big void, or all those angles that they took with that shaft were by design.
Yeah. So I think that there was meticulous engineering in these things, and everything that they did was very intentional. And I love the fact that you brought up this big void, because it's located above the quote unquote Grand Gallery chamber.
Right.
And I have a perfect explanation for what this thing was doing and how it was implemented into this chemical reaction process. Because the reaction of dissolving sulfur trioxide into water is an extremely exothermic reaction, generates a ton of heat. So if you have an ancillary chamber above your contact process chamber where that reaction was occurring, you can absorb that heat energy and remove it from the structure. This directly ties into the function of the black basalt floor that is adjacent to the Great Pyramid, because that hot water from inside of the void above the Grand Gallery was flowing out of that chamber and running through the channels that are underneath this black basalt floor on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, heating up that material.
Do you have like an image of this I can see so I can better understand it?
So let's say here, probably not in this particular, but we can just run through this part real quick.
Okay.
So again, air was coming through those air intakes.
In the King's chamber.
In the King's chamber.
Okay.
That mixture of gases was being pulled through the antechamber. And the antechamber of the Great Pyramid is made from red granite along with this furnace chamber. And I've already mentioned that.
You're saying the antechamber was the furnace chamber, or no? Or that was the King's chamber?
So the antechamber is actually your catalyst chamber. It is a sound catalyst chamber, something called sonochemistry, acoustic chemistry, where you can use sound waves to catalyze chemical reactions. This goes back to the inverse piezoelectric property of quartz, where electric fields were flowing into the red granite and activating the inverse piezoelectric property of quartz, creating vibrations that elicit ultrasound. And ultrasound is basically sonochemistry. They use ultrasound vibrations to create chemical reactions.
Okay.
And that's what was occurring inside of the antechamber. And I have a whole slide deck on the sonochemical reactions inside of the Great Pyramid.
So which one of these chambers is what?
Yep. Okay, so let's go back here.
Okay, the burner is a King's chamber.
Correct. Yeah, the converter where you see SO2 going into a catalyst chamber.
Yes.
That's your antechamber.
Okay.
Then you have your absorption tower, which is your Grand Gallery, and your dilution and extraction tank is your Queen's chamber.
Okay.
So keep this configuration in mind, where you have King's chamber, antechamber, contact process chamber,
Grand
and
Gallery.
extraction chamber.
Okay.
So again, another depiction here showing the process.
Okay.
And this is, again, just kind of an explanation of how sulfuric acid is utilized as for the manufacture of fertilizers, metallurgical processes, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get to the configuration of the Great Pyramid here in just a second. But if you take the sulfuric acid that was being produced in the Great Pyramid, and then you introduce it into the Central Pyramid, which is the middle pyramid on the Giza Plateau, you can fill that chamber with a concentrated solution of sodium chloride. Introduce your sulfuric acid solution into that chamber, and it will create hydrogen chloride gas, which can then be dissolved into water to create hydrochloric acid. So there's a connection between my work and Christopher Dunn's work in that I do believe hydrochloric acid was being manufactured on the Giza Plateau. And I don't think he goes into an explanation of where the hydrochloric acid comes from.
No.
But in the Central Pyramid, it has the exact same configuration, and they found a sodium chloride coating inside the chambers of the Central Pyramid. So you need sodium chloride, salt, to create the chemical reaction between sulfuric acid and the sodium chloride to create hydrochloric acid. And they found that salt coating inside of the chamber, the primary chamber of the Central Pyramid.
Okay, so can you explain to me one more time?
Yes.
The Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
All of the chambers. Where does this process start?
All right. So the process actually starts in the subterranean chamber.
Okay.
And there's a guy named John Cadman that proposed that the subterranean chamber is a pump chamber. He believes that it was used to pump water out of the structure through that southern shaft outside of the subterranean chamber. So there's a shaft going down into the subterranean chamber from the north. There's a pit leading out of the bottom, and then there's a shaft going out of the southern end.
That goes nowhere, right?
That goes nowhere, correct. So John Cadman's theory is that it was a pump to pump water out of that southern shaft. The big issue with that is it's a completely dead-end shaft.
Right.
And I was just in there for a special permission inside the Great Pyramid, and we got great documentation where all of us climbed through that southern shaft because I wanted to get it on camera to prove that that was a dead-end shaft and nothing could be pumped out in that direction. But I do believe that the configuration of the subterranean chamber is indicative of a pump chamber that pumped water from the subterranean chamber up through the well shaft into the Grand Gallery and Queen's Chamber.
Okay.
So
And where did the water come from? Just like the ground?
So there's subterranean water below the Great Pyramid for sure, but all of these pyramids had external reservoirs. They had enclosures surrounding the structures that were filled with water to facilitate these chemical reactions. And even in the ancient descriptions, they talk about the pyramids being floating islands. So they were surrounded by these reservoir enclosures that were utilized, for example, in the operation of the Red Pyramid. The water from the reservoir was introduced into that inlet shaft and utilized to facilitate the chemical reactions inside the Red Pyramid.
Okay.
Same thing happened in the Great Pyramid where that water was introduced into the subterranean chamber. The northern pump shaft was filled, right? So you have an external reservoir.
Do you have a diagram?
Let's see here.
Okay, right there. That's perfect.
Yeah.
So number 5, the subterranean chamber is, bless you.
Yep. So the external reservoir surrounding the Great Pyramid basically came up to where you see the number 1, where that inlet shaft is. So the water would have poured down into the subterranean chamber. And if you put a pump block into that northern chamber and compressed it down into the shaft, it will push water up through that well shaft.
The vertical one.
Correct. And I believe that there's even important information encoded in the conventional archaeological nomenclature, right? It's a well shaft. They call it a well shaft.
Okay.
So what's the function of a well? To deliver water. So that is the exact function of this well shaft, is by activating your subterranean pump chamber, you're pumping water up through the well shaft, delivering it into your Queen's Chamber and Grand Gallery chamber.
Now, number 6, was that
Yep.
Was that originally there? Or was that dug through?
Yeah. So where you see number 2 here, that is the excavated cavity that was carved into the Great Pyramid to gain access into the structure in the modern day.
Right.
In number 6 is a vertical, like a diagonally inclined shaft that has these granite plug blocks. And even the conventional archaeology states, and that's why I have this little red circle, because these red granite blocks were originally at the top of that shaft. And it was a emergency shut-off mechanism that if the pressure inside of the chamber ever got too high, it would release those plug blocks, push them down into the bottom of that shaft to relieve the pressure inside of the system. So there was something catastrophic that happened to these Egyptian pyramids that caused them to go offline. And they all have emergency shut-off mechanisms built in, same thing as you would have with a modern chemical reactor, where if something goes catastrophically wrong, you have to have an immediate shut-off valve to prevent the situation from just blowing the whole structure to pieces.
Right.
So that was my idea on the function of these red granite plug blocks and of shaft number 6.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit, but let's imagine that the Great Pyramid gets struck by lightning. There's an accumulation of positive charges from these telluric currents in the earth. So you have these flowing electrical currents that move through the crust of the earth. And this is where these dielectric materials are incredibly important. So Chris Dunn talks about seismic waves. I'm talking about naturally occurring electric currents in these telluric currents that are flowing below these structures. And the limestone is a dielectric material that is going to store these electric charges and cause a phenomenon called dielectric polarization of the material. And this is how batteries work today, where you get a slight negative charge at the bottom, slight positive charge at the top. You have a separation of your charges that allow the storage of electricity. So this is why modern batteries, you have a conductor, you have a dielectric material, and another conductor. And it's the magic of these dielectric materials that allow us to store energy in batteries. This is exactly what was happening inside of all of these structures, including the ancient structures of England and Ireland, where they were storing electric currents from these telluric earth currents on the surface of the earth. And they either have obelisks, pillars, or standing stones, or at the Great Pyramid being the tallest structure. Well, technically the Central Pyramid is the tallest one, but I truly believe that the Great Pyramid was designed without a capstone. It was meant to be flat at the top, which increases the surface area at the top of the pyramid to allow the accumulation of positive charges. And I have there's another episode that I've done on the channel where they've introduced electromagnetic charges into a simulation of the Great Pyramid. And it was designed to accumulate charges directly where the capstone is missing. So in this experiment, they introduced an electromagnetic field into a simulated design of the Great Pyramid. And there's literally a flat part at the top of the structure where all of these charges accumulate where there is no capstone. It's in the exact same location. And I believe that was the intentional design of the Great Pyramid, was to leave it without a capstone to allow the accumulation of positive charges on the surface of the structure to attract these lightning strikes.
Okay. And they needed the lightning strikes because it would charge the stones and blocks inside the pyramid?
Correct. Yeah. So the limestone, again, is a dielectric material, and it is going to store the electric fields from these lightning strikes. And this is also how these ancient stone circles like Avebury, they were used to attract lightning strikes by harnessing these electric fields on the surface of the earth. You have a standing stone or a pillar, which provides the lightning strike a location to hit, and then they distribute the electric fields throughout the rest of the temple complex. So Avebury is known as the Serpent Temple Complex. And I believe that the serpent is an ancient symbol for, well, there's also the plumed serpent, the deity Kukulkan, which descends onto the pyramid of Teotihuacan. This is another symbol encoded in that structure that indicates lightning. We'll get to that here in just a second. I've got some slides on Teotihuacan and the symbolism of the feathered serpent.
Right.
Lightning, right? The plumed serpent. That is an ancient symbol for lightning strikes.
These chemicals come out of the pyramid and the chemicals come out of those pits on the outside.
Yes. So the acidic solutions from inside of the reaction chambers are pumped through these pits.
And do we know for a fact where those pits connect to? Or do they really connect to the Queen's Chamber like Chris Dunn theorizes?
I believe they do. So I agree with his theory that the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid is connected into these pits.
Okay.
So we also have a connection between the Tomb of the Birds that I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, where this is a huge metallic ore mining tunnel. And they were introducing these acidic solutions the solutions flowed down the Giza Plateau, and everything was being collected in the Sphinx enclosure. So the Sphinx enclosure has tunnels on the back side of the Sphinx enclosure that nobody ever talks about, these tunnel openings on the back of the Sphinx enclosure. And these tunnel openings lead back to the central pyramid. And then also we had the corroboration of this idea by the lead inspector of the Giza Plateau that mentioned the tunnels that lead from the Great Pyramid down to the Sphinx enclosure.
Okay, but how does the chemicals get to those pits on the outside?
Yep. So
From the inside of the Great Pyramid.
So, for example, there was an extraction shaft out of the Queen's chamber that was used to remove the aqueous solution, the dilute solution of sulfuric acid, from the Queen's chamber, and then it's distributed across the Giza Plateau.
So there's a shaft in the bottom of the Queen's chamber?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Directly below the niche. And this has been mentioned in all of the archaeological reports. So they excavated down below the niche. It's this area called the niche inside the Queen's chamber. And they excavated down in there. And there's several archaeological reports that there's not only shafts, but chambers underneath there. Now, I also have another episode where they did a 3D Doppler radar scan of the Great Pyramid. And if you pull that up, 3D Doppler radar scan of the Great Pyramid, it reveals that there's a ton of hidden structures inside of the Great. I just don't have that episode. I have it in my body of work, but I just didn't pull it up for this particular conversation. But if you Google that, there you go. Yep, just pull up any of those images, and it actually revealed this extraction shaft below the Queen's chamber. Yeah, synthetic aperture Doppler radar tomography of the Great Pyramid. And there's a whole bunch of very cool diagrams in this that show all of the...
I don't think you're going to find it here.
Yeah, no, keep scrolling down.
Math.
Yep.
You can go faster.
Yeah, so it talks... Yep. There we go. There we go.
There we go.
Up. Right there, yeah.
Okay, blow that up.
Yeah. So you see there's a whole bunch of hidden components still inside of the Great Pyramid. And if you look at number 13 and 15, that is the area right below the Queen's chamber. You see that red square? So 13 is the Queen's chamber right there in the center. Yep, 13. Okay. And you see that shaft leading out of the Queen's chamber?
Yeah,
yep.
15.
Yep. So this is the extraction shaft.
And that we don't see that on modern diagrams of the pyramid?
No. So this was basically an illegal scan of the Great Pyramid. They use this Doppler radar technology to scan the Great Pyramid. And this is a diagram showing their interpretation of this Doppler radar scan results. But I found it very interesting that it does corroborate the existence of a shaft.
Shit. So that 15 could go to the shafts that go to the outside.
Yeah, so those are basically intermediary collection chambers. And those intermediary collection chambers would have been connected to the outside of the structure through a shaft system that allowed the solution to flow out of the reaction chambers onto the Giza Plateau.
Okay.
And I believe, for example, the trial passages adjacent to the Great Pyramid are actually part of a pumping system that was used to pump the solution across the Giza Plateau.
So this was all to just create sulfuric acid.
Yes. Sulfuric acid has a ton of applications, not only for mining, which I don't believe this was just for the Giza Plateau. We're talking about all across Africa.
Okay.
There is prolific evidence of significant mining activities all over Africa. So they were collecting some of the solution. They were using some of it for in situ leach mining, which means on site. And we do the same thing today where we have a production facility for sulfuric acid, producing the chemical on site for in situ leach mining.
Okay.
But that Doppler radar scan does corroborate the existence of the extraction shaft below the Queen's chamber.
And and then obviously with the sulfuric acid, since sulfuric acid is known today as one of the chemicals we use in metallurgy.
Yes.
We assume that we use the sulfuric acid. They use the sulfuric acid to create metals and saws and tools and stuff.
Correct. Yeah. So you can use it for mining applications, but then you can also use it for purification and isolation of certain metals. So you can also use it to dissolve gold. When you have hydrochloric acid and nitric acid, you can create something called aqua regia, which is used to dissolve gold. Yeah, so you can see that there's some very intricate structures.
And that what's that 19? That green
19
thing?
is the void.
The big void. Okay.
Yeah. So that so this paper is discussing the technical application of 3D Doppler radar scanning to examine ancient structures. That's why there's so much math in this thing, is they're really assessing the technological capabilities of the radar scanning and not necessarily the results. But they do present the results of the scanning, and then they extrapolate from those results a new diagram of hidden internal components inside the Great Pyramid. But they do substantiate, like you said, number 19, this large void above the Grand Gallery, which again, it's in a perfect location to capture the thermal energy that was being released during the exothermic reaction that creates sulfuric acid. And that thermal energy was being removed from the structure, flowing below the black basalt floor adjacent to the Great Pyramid that was directly involved in producing these thunderstorm clouds, producing more lightning. It was literally a thunderstorm and lightning generating system.
Whoa.
Which connects to Randall Carlson's work, where they discovered that the slope angle of the Great Pyramid is the ideal vector for creating the mixture of these two air fronts, hot air coming off of one side, cold air coming off of another side, and mixing in the atmosphere to create these cumulonimbus thunderstorm and lightning clouds. So we talk about the black basalt being a heat storage material. You're removing the heat energy from inside of the chemical reaction system. You're moving it under the black basalt floor. The air rushing over the black basalt floor is heated and swept into the atmosphere at the ideal angle for generating these cumulonimbus thunderstorm clouds and thus more lightning.
Got it. Which would strike the pyramid.
Correct.
And then charge all this.
Correct. So it's a self-repeating system where they're harnessing naturally occurring telluric currents to attract lightning. The chemical reaction sequence is used for chemical applications, but then it's also used to generate more lightning.
Right.
And
man.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even gotten to the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire. How I came across the conclusion that all of these structures were designed to harness lightning. And this is by what I learned at the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England. I intuitively had the idea that the pyramids were powered by lightning, but I didn't understand the mechanisms of operation until I started looking at dielectric materials. Dielectrics, again, it's the secret in the stone, right? All of these stones are functional materials.
Right.
Black basalt storing heat, red granite for ultrasound, limestone for dielectric capacity of storing electric fields. There's a very specific reason that they chose all of these construction materials. And once you understand these properties, everything just starts to reveal itself. So here we have the Giza Plateau Chemical Manufacturing Plant. Sulfuric acid in the Great Pyramid. Hydrochloric acid in the Central Pyramid. And I haven't revealed my function of the third and final Menkaure pyramid, but it was operational and it was producing a chemical.
Now,
yes.
Go back to that photo.
Yeah.
Those things are enormous.
Oh, it's crazy, yeah.
And when I think about Chris Dunn's theory of the pyramids, right? His theory essentially is that Great Pyramid, whether the other two are involved or not, he does assume they're involved. He just doesn't have an explanation exactly for how it works. He doesn't reverse engineer the other two.
Right.
But when I look at those, I think that's got to have an extremely important role in whatever civilization lived around there
100%.
And built them.
Yes.
And when you think about something that provides energy to the entire civilization, that feels right.
Yes.
Because it's so monumental and so precise and so enormous.
Yep.
Now, when you look at there's nothing like those in the history of the earth. There's nothing like these things. Now, when you say that they're chemical processing plants for sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid for mining and metallurgy,
Yes.
it's not as wild of a theory right? It makes it makes a lot of sense how that could work.
Yep.
I completely understand it, especially when you involve how the other pyramids are involved. But I just don't understand why. Like, it seems like such a benign sort of like simple explanation for such an enormous, monumental, incredible feat
Yep.
of humans.
Okay. So, but that's only the chemical manufacturing application. So today, if we could harness the power from a lightning strike, you can power a city for a year off of one lightning bolt. It is a massive amount of electrical energy. It is the most powerful electrical phenomenon on this planet is lightning. So by harnessing lightning, they could produce, or harness rather, vast amounts of electric energy, which could then be distributed throughout the civilization. I don't get into that application because, again, I don't have any evidence of devices that were connected into this electricity. I believe it has other applications. For example, with the Serpent Temple complex in Avebury, that electric field energy was being distributed into something called the sanctuary, which was designed to accumulate negative ions and ozone, which are used for therapeutic applications and healing. So there's a completely different aspect that we haven't even, it's part of my, dude, for us to do this properly, I would need like 8 hours
Right.
to go through all of this material. So I have a slide deck ready for the Avebury Serpent Temple complex.
Where is this complex?
It's in, it's basically near the White Horse Hills in Wiltshire, England.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So all of these are a huge interconnected system. So remember, okay, so it's for chemical manufacturing. The most important process that we do in our modern world is manufacture chemicals. They are the basis of our entire modern civilization is chemistry. So it's incredibly important to our modern civilization, the production of chemicals. But we also have harnessing of electric field energy from lightning and terraforming. So they're literally turning a desert into a lush area of agricultural farmland. So it has all of the applications of electrical production, but then so much more.
Right. To feed the civilization that was there.
Everything. So we're not just producing mining chemicals. Remember, it's fertilizer, it's methane gas for heating and lighting and cooking and all of these sort of domestic applications. So you literally have a variety of chemicals that could sustain your entire civilization. Just the chemical manufacturing. Then you have a source of electric energy, not only for powering these chemical reactions, but also for therapeutic processes in these temples that we'll get to here in just a second, hopefully. And then you have terraforming, bringing these cumulonimbus thunderstorm clouds that rain. They also bear rain. So that's what I'm proposing, is that the Egyptian pyramids were involved in the terraforming of the Upper Eastern Sahara during the Saharan wet period. That by building these structures, they were creating more rain clouds that completely transformed the Sahara from a barren wasteland of sand into an area of lush agricultural development.
Wow. Okay.
So it has immense applications. And it's, again, to look at all of these three structures just on the Giza Plateau and only focus on the one, you're missing a huge part of the story. What were the other two doing? Why build the rest of this complex?
Right.
It's a huge complex that is connected underground. Again, the Tomb of the Birds, these underground mining tunnels that run below the Giza Plateau. What we can see above ground is only 50% of the story. There's so much more below the earth, underneath this temple complex, that will probably never be revealed, but we can only speculate on what's actually below there. But I've physically been down into the Tomb of the Birds, so I know that this does exist. And this tunnel is filled with all of this metallic ore, mineral deposits, and it looks like it's been leached out, just eroded out using acidic chemicals.
Wow, man.
And that's what these pits are on the Giza Plateau. So this is an image of these silicate microspherules that were discovered in the chemical analysis that was taken from around the Trial Passages, which are adjacent to the Great Pyramid, from fulgurites, So this is literally the closest evidence that we have that lightning was striking the area around the Great Pyramid. I believe it was striking the top of the structure directly. Those electric fields get distributed down into the bedrock, which is causing the creation of these fulgurites and these silicate microspherules.
Okay.
This sample was taken from around the trial passages, which you can see a diagram of here, which I believe was an intermediary pump station designed to pump these solutions across the Giza Plateau. Here's an area showing the opening of the trial passages, some of the iron ore where this sample was taken. So you see that red iron ore.
Right.
This stuff is all over the Giza Plateau, and it is eroded in such a way that is very indicative of acidic erosion. So I found it interesting that you mentioned that Dunn says it was coming from the pits into the Queen's Chamber, but I think it was the opposite direction. It was coming from the Queen's Chamber, flowing into these pits, and then down the plateau, converging in the Sphinx enclosure.
Okay.
Again, a close-up image of one of those silicate microspherules from the lightning strikes. All right, so now this is a paper. Again, I don't know why it's doing this, where the stuff that I highlighted is actually blocked out.
Can't see it, yeah.
yeah, but this paper, Telluric and Earth Currents, Lightning Strike Locations and Natural Resource Exploitation, is a whole research paper talking about how telluric currents have a controlling impact on lightning strike locations. And there's a significant relationship between solar and lunar phenomenon and the occurrence of lightning, which gets into the function of Stonehenge, which was also designed as a solar and lunar observatory for tracking these phenomenon so that they could predict when these lightning strikes were going to occur.
Okay. Let's dig in.
It's again, the more I work on this, the more. So this is me investigating this huge iron oxide pit that's adjacent to the central pyramid.
Okay.
And this is just talking about, so again, I was talking about Stonehenge. This is an image of Stonehenge, solar and lunar observatory.
What is the conventional theory for Stonehenge?
Basically the same thing. That's a widely accepted explanation for Stonehenge. Is that it's a astronomical observatory.
Right.
But I believe it was also designed to harness these lightning strikes.
Okay.
But it was absolutely used as a tracking device so that they could plan the conjunction of these solar and lunar phenomenon and accurately predict when these lightning strikes were going to occur.
Near Stonehenge.
Correct. I believe in the center of the structure.
In the center. So is Stonehenge up on like a big hill?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was a central, it's now knocked over, and they call the center of Stonehenge a cell. And it's called the altar stone. It's now been toppled over, but it was originally the tallest of the stones inside of this structure, which would I believe would have been your obelisk or your pillar stone, your standing stone that harnessed these lightning strikes and distributed it into the bedrock.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the first White Horse Hill. You can see on the face of it, you can't really see it in this picture, but there's a white horse inscribed in the side of the hill right there in that little depression.
When was that put there?
So that's a relatively modern addition.
Right.
And these were added to all of these hills where lightning phenomenon occurs naturally. As soon as I put out this episode, I was contacted by a ton of people that live in this area recounting that they used to watch thunderstorms move down these white chalk hills. And all of these hills are white chalk, which is the same chemical composition of limestone, but just a different geological process in the formation. So it's all calcium carbonate chalk, a dielectric material.
Is that similar to what you were saying accumulated on the insides of those shafts in the Great Pyramid? You said there was like a salt chalky substance.
That's calcium sulfate.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a reaction between sulfuric acid and limestone.
Okay.
So this is calcium carbonate chalk. The bedrock of all of these structures across England is all on a foundation of chalk bedrock. So Avebury is built on chalk. These White Horse Hills are built on chalk. Silbury Hill is made of chalk on chalk bedrock. And they selected these materials very intentionally because of these dielectric electric field storage properties. So you can see that the face of this hill has a scoop and an angle, I haven't tested it, but I would almost bet that this is the same angle as the slope of the face of the Great Pyramid.
51 point something
51
degrees.
and a half degrees,
Right.
correct, which is the ideal vector for sweeping a hot air front and a cold air front into the atmosphere that generates cumulonimbus clouds. So this is how the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England work. There was an obelisk or a standing stone at the top of the structure. You have the telluric currents flowing through the crust of the earth, causing dielectric polarization of the chalk material. So you have an accumulation of positive charges at the top and negative charges toward the bottom. This is going to attract your lightning strike, which chemically transforms the calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, releasing carbon dioxide. There's also a reservoir at the top of this hill, and there's a source of water running below this structure. There's modern water pumps at the bottom of this hill today. I think I have, the water pumps here.
Oh, wow.
So there's a water source where they could have pumped this water to the top of the hill to fill the reservoir. So the water pours down the face of the hill, and there's a chemical reaction that occurs between the calcium oxide and water to create calcium hydroxide, which releases an immense amount of heat. This is an incredibly windy area where there's wind currents sweeping off the surface of this hill. Very similar to what I kind of touched on with the Great Pyramid, where the black basalt floor adjacent to the Great Pyramid was heated. The air moving across that black basalt floor was swept into the atmosphere at the ideal angle to create this circulation of a hot air front and a cold air front that generates cumulonimbus clouds. This is exactly what's depicted here in this diagram, is that there is an interface between hot air front and cold air front that creates cumulonimbus clouds, lightning clouds. So again, it is a system for the generation. So first step is capturing naturally occurring lightning. That naturally occurring lightning is then distributed through the system to create a chemical reaction that creates more thunderstorm clouds and more lightning.
Wow.
The power source of all of these systems is a regenerative process where I said this at the beginning, that these structures were designed to operate in conjunction with the forces of the earth.
Right.
So they're using these naturally occurring electric currents from telluric currents. They're harnessing the electric energy from lightning, and the whole thing works in a cycle, producing more and more lightning, more and more thunderclouds.
Wow, man.
And so again, in a thunderstorm, when you have a lightning strike, you have accumulation of negative charges in the cloud itself, and you have accumulation of positive charges. Here you can see the White Horse.
Yep.
And then in the right corner, you can see the obelisk. And in the top, you can see the reservoir at the top of the hill. And you can see that it looks like water was flowing down from that reservoir down the surface of the hill. You see that
Yep.
Fluid erosion?
Yep.
It's literally pouring from that reservoir down into this valley, causing that chemical reaction that generates calcium oxide and generates an immense amount of heat sweeping off of that hill front.
So you think that this site was essentially doing the same thing that the Great Pyramid was doing?
Correct.
It's just a rudimentary version of it.
Correct. Yeah. So I believe that
But it was intentionally created that way.
Yes.
It was man-made.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So when we were hiking up this hill, both Alexa and I noticed that it appeared that the surface of this hill was terraformed. The whole hill could have possibly been man-made. And that's what we see in Silbury Hill, the proto-pyramid. It's the largest mound in Europe. It's a proto-pyramid that's made of chalk. And I'm pretty sure I have this in the slide deck, but this is just talking about this white horse symbol that permeates all of these ancient religions and mythology, symbolizing thunderstorm clouds and lightning. So on the surface of these ancient hills, they literally emblazoned it with the symbol, depicting exactly what the function of these things were.
Wow, man.
The white horse, the cumulonimbus cloud,
Right.
and lightning storm. So we talk about, you hear this mythology of secrets in plain sight. And there's a whole bunch of these white horse hills all over Wiltshire, England, that have the exact same configuration. You can see another one here on the right where there's a scoop on the front of the hill, there's a scoop on the back of the hill, a reservoir at the top, and it featured a standing stone. So the exact same chemical reaction, lightning struck the standing stone, it was distributed into the chalk, creating calcium hydroxide, releasing heat. The water was pouring down the far side that you can see in this picture. You can see there's no outlet of the reservoir near the horse,
Right.
and there's also no erosion. But if you look at the other side, all of this has water erosion moving down the surface of the far hill.
Yeah.
The exact same function where the hot air system was sweeping off of the far side, the cold air front was coming off of the horse side, mixing in the atmosphere and creating cumulonimbus thunderstorm cloud. This is exactly what Randall Carlson was talking about. The slope angle of the Great Pyramid being the ideal vector for creating thunderstorm clouds. So they inevitably...
They tied all that mathematics and sacred geometry into that thunderstorm generator that Malcolm Bendall is working on.
Yeah.
But they have a great way of explaining it very fast with complex math.
Sure.
Basically, you get lost when you're trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
But
And I haven't delved into the mechanics of the thunderstorm generator, but I was watching your podcast with Randall, and he was talking about the slope angle. And then I knew that there was a connection between these two things. He's working on this modern machine, and it just so happens that it points to this exact same slope angle as being the ideal configuration for the generation of thunderstorm clouds.
right.
So again, there's interesting connections between my work and Dunn's work, my work and Randall Carlson's work, where it all works synergistically. The whole picture comes together. And I took this information from understanding the White Horse Hills of Wiltshire, England, and then I went back and I applied it to the Great Pyramid, and everything just clicked. The whole thing started to make sense. So again, the White Horse. This is Silbury Hill, a huge pyramid structure in very, very close proximity to these White Horse Hills. You can see that it also has a reservoir that was intended to be flooded. This is a huge hill that's made of chalk. And so you'll see here that the surface of this is flat.
Right.
That was intentional to allow the accumulation of positive charges at the top of the monument. So Yusuf and I did a test. So he has a machine, this machine that you can see down here called the life force generator. And this is one of these machines, I don't understand the mechanisms of operation that make the machine work, but it's supposed to generate an electromagnetic energy field.
Okay.
So we tested the properties of stone in electromagnetic field experiment number 1, and it shows that the charges that are stored inside of the limestone can be released if you give it a conductor, that piece of copper. If you put that piece of copper up against the red granite, nothing happens because the electric field is being used to create ultrasound. The electric field is dissipated inside of the red granite, which is the exact function of the red granite, is to use that electric field for the production of ultrasound. So there's no discharge when you put the piece of copper next to the red granite, but there is a discharge when you put it next to the limestone. In electromagnetic field experiment number 1, we tested amorphous shapes of limestone, red granite, black basalt, and calcite crystal. In experiment number 2, I had Yusuf carve a pyramid shape of limestone, and that's what we're testing here. And as you move to the top of the pyramid, the discharge completely disappears because there's no surface area on the apex of a pyramid. That is why the Great Pyramid was intentionally left without a capstone to provide more surface area for the accumulation of electric fields. Exactly what you're seeing here is the accumulation of these electric fields at the top of the Great Pyramid. Boom, I do have it in here, I think.
If you hit escape on that keyboard, you'll be able to see them all.
I might not have that. I think I put it in a separate episode because it was so deserving of a separate episode. But in with using one of the wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, the top of the pyramid completely turns red indicating the highest accumulation of electric field.
Right.
And it stops literally at the top of the pyramid, exactly like you see here. And the capstone is blue, indicating that there would be zero accumulation of electric field in the capstone, quote unquote capstone. So I believe it was intentionally left flat, exactly like Silbury Hill was left flat, to allow the accumulation of these electric fields at the top of the structure. And this is, again, the paper that we were talking about before. Study reveals the Great Pyramid of Giza can focus electromagnetic energy, not only inside of the chambers, but also at the top of the structure.
Wow.
So you have lightning striking the top of the Great Pyramid. Okay, same accumulation of positive charges attracting these negatively charged lightning strikes. When you look at Silbury Hill, this massive mound of chalk, it's doing the exact same thing.
Right.
The telluric currents are flowing through the earth. Positive charges are accumulating at the top of the structure, attracting lightning. Same chemical reaction recurs, leaving calcium oxide. The reservoir is flooded, creating heat to create your thunderstorm clouds. And it just so happens that Silbury Hill, at number 1 on this diagram, is located next to a structure called Windmill Hill. It's a wind hill. So the hot air coming off of Silbury Hill was sweeping off of one side of Windmill Hill. So you have all of this heat energy coming off of Silbury Hill, sweeping up one side of Windmill Hill, and the cold air front is coming in off the other side, creating these cumulonimbus clouds.